Welcome to another classical music podcast. My guest today is the great pianist and piano professor Boris Slutsky, someone I have wanted to talk to and to invite onto this podcast for a long time, as Boris is not only a wonderful pianist and, of course, a wonderful teacher, but also someone that I have known for not just the entirety of my professional, but my pre-professional life as well. Boris is the son of my very first violin teacher, of blessed memory, Larry Slutsky. So, first of all, please welcome Boris Slutsky.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for making the time. I always like to start these conversations off by telling the guests to whom it is that they're speaking, because it's not really to me. We're having this conversation for the benefit, essentially, of students, parents, people who are involved in the musical world but don't yet know what the musical world really is. And in this, we can start by talking about our respective parents and the fact that we grew up in the musical world, knowing very well what it is. I actually wanted to start not with an announced topic, but with something that I've always been curious about. You grew up in a house of a violinist and a violist. When did you start the piano, and was it your initiative or theirs?
That I don't really remember. I was told that anytime I would come in contact with the piano, which we didn't have at the time, but at other people's homes, I was told that I would go to the piano and start picking out some tunes. I don't remember that. I think that was made up to convince me that this was why my parents needed to start the lessons for me. But yes, I did grow up in the house of a violinist and violist, but my grandmother was a pianist, so piano has always been important.
But your grandmother was a professional pianist?
Yes, she was professional pianist. She taught for 60 years or close to that.
I wonder if our grandmothers also knew each other, because I think my mom's mother was a piano teacher, but not an institution, a private studio teacher.
My grandmother was from Baku, so I doubt it.
Oh, okay. I haven't been able to trace my family, but the whole idea of sort of doing what the parents do, picking up on the fact that there's music in the house, um, for those people who are not the children of professional musicians, how vital do you find it is for successful students to have music in the house, basically, uh, as a constant?
Well, I think it gives a certain vibe, certain background. However, I don't think it's very important. I remember uh, that my father always wanted to practice with me, and I always disagreed with, first of all, the idea of him practicing with, and second, with what he had to say. So that those were not happy memories.
Well, that's exactly why my mother sent me to your father.
Well, my father also told me that thank God I'm not playing violin, because otherwise I would be crying more often than I did. Uh, Having professional musicians as parents, of course, makes it much easier in many ways to associate yourself with the profession, and much harder because the expectations
Yeah.
are so much higher, and there's really very little that you can do that would come up to the bar that was set for you. So it's both ways.
But on the sort of the side that is not exactly positive and not exactly negative, there's just the idea that as a child you mimic your parents. As a growing child, you start to assert your independence. I have told so many students' parents, when they tell me that my kid won't listen when I tell them that you said to do this or that, and I say, listen, if you were a professional musician, they wouldn't listen to you either. I tell them about myself and my mother. about my mother's stories about coming to David Oistrak's house and hearing Igor and David Oistrakh arguing about violin matters. And now, I have the story of you and your father. Um, the idea that you would be unable to learn from your parents is something I think most parents are unaware of. But being exposed to not only listening to pieces of music, but also just the awareness of um, the day-to-day realities of the musical world, watching your mom and dad get ready to go and play a concert with the Baltimore Symphony. Were you still living at home when they?
I was not, but I remember when we still lived in Russia about the concert preparations and my father's students coming to the house to take lessons. And I disagree. I think most people understand that it's not ideal to have a parent teaching a child for various reasons. There have been very few examples, actually, of successes where parents taught their children. And even,
Even though there are many musical families where.
yes, I mean, it has nothing to do with having to teach your own child.
Yes.
Um, so, yes, I remember vividly all of those things and how serious people took their professional obligations. Um, I also have to say that in terms of choosing this as my life, as a career, uh, I don't, until I turned 13, I was serious, serious. I mean, I was practicing and I went to a wonderful school, a professional school. But I don't think it didn't dawn on me that this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life until about 13 or 14.
That's also a story that I have heard from many students, who by the time they come to me and they're preparing for college, it's almost always that age, 12 or 13. They say, I was playing when I was 6, but it wasn't really serious, and there were some years that were wasted. And then I was playing, and it was more serious, but I still didn't know that I wanted to do this for real. And then.
I no, believe me, I was serious. My parents made sure that I was.
I,
I remember going. It's a very funny thought to have at that age. But I remember going to school on a Saturday and seeing it during the winter time and seeing all my friends outside playing hockey and thinking, why am I doing this? I mean, yes, I kind of like it. It's cool to play, but what if a war breaks out and what good am I going to um, do for people, for society? Those kinds of thoughts
I,
were going through my mind. And at that age, of course, I didn't realize what music can actually do for people. And
well, for the audiences, yes, but also for the musicians, the way that being in the profession molds your character.
yeah,
Yeah. I think the thought that you just mentioned, I actually remember having literally the same thought, but much later when I was at a festival and the putsch happened in Russia. And I remember my roommate, who is now a member of the Vienna Philharmonic, my roommate and I were watching this whole thing unfold on television. And I turned to him and I said, "What are we doing here? There's this thing going on, and here we are debating fingerings and solo Bach. When you stop to think of it that way, you can convince yourself that it's irrelevant. But then when you see what happens in the concert hall and what happens with musicians working together, the questions fade."
it's a complicated issue. It can be looked at and discussed from many different angles. So I always tell my students, grown-up students who ask me what they should do in life, whether they should do something else or continue with music. My answer is always the same. It's not, it's something that you cannot live without. There are many people who are fantastic musicians, but they make their living doing something else. And I'm sure you know plenty of examples of really fantastic instrumentalists, pianists, violinists who love music, who know music, who live music, but they make their living doing
Not,
other things.
not for nothing do so many major cities have doctors' orchestras and lawyers' orchestras. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, unless one is completely consumed with this idea that there's nothing else in the world that would give you this light at the end of the tunnel, that would give you this something to strive for, to live. If you don't have that, it's much better to do something else because it's much easier to make a living. It's much easier to exist. This,
Well, one of the things that I find most difficult about this profession is that other jobs seem to have well established goalposts, markers, and paths. You know, you enter a company at this level and you get promoted to this and so on. The application process for a job and so on. There is no application process for a solo spot with the Baltimore Symphony.
true, true.
You know, there's a very amorphous or at least difficult to discern shape to the career path that everyone makes for themselves. Um, and actually, that's another place that I wanted to begin with you. You know, when that path begins with the choice of conservatory, uh, that decision, I think, is a vital one. Would you agree that that is a life altering decision potentially?
There are two things, two thoughts that I have. More than a specific place, I think it's important to find the right person who would guide you. Because you don't go to Juilliard to study with Mr. Juilliard or to Peabody to study with Mr. Peabody. I think it's so important to have a person who you trust implicitly, whose opinion you don't question, because that's I think at some level that's how you begin to learn. And then of course, the longer it is, then you start having questions, and I always welcome those. But I remember with two of my very, very influential, very important teachers, one Anna Kantor in Russia, and another one, Alexander Edelman, um, in New York. I've been very fortunate, to digress a little bit, to have some really fantastic people who influenced me over the years as teachers. But those two, I think, I would consider the most important ones in many ways. So at first, I just knew that if I did what they told me, it would work exactly as they say it would. And I there's also a difference, I think, cultural difference between learning music in, let's say, in Russia or China or Korea or Japan, and in the United States and perhaps the other Western countries. I don't know.
And I think the United States is standalone in the amount of latitude students are sometimes given. Um,
Perhaps. I just can't say I have never studied in the European countries or I've taught some, but not that much. So the amount of respect that one has for the teacher, unquestionable trust and respect, is something very different. I think on some level it promotes learning before you begin to ask questions. If you start by negating everything you're told and asking questions, there's really not much that you can learn. You first have to absorb something that's being passed on to you, and then, of course, the questions come, and it's natural, and the more the better. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
no, no. On the contrary, I think this.
Yeah, so you asked about conservatories. There are so many good teachers. I don't know so much about the violin,
But we're talking for musicians in general. Pianists
for
is much.
musicians in general, I would say that the most important thing is to find a person, a guide, a teacher, a sensei, who would lead you, who you would trust, and who would be able to inspire you and guide you and lead you to discover your own world. Much more important than the place where that takes place. Yes, of course, being in, for instance, I'm talking about Juilliard all the time because that's where I went for several years, and that's sort of considered one of the most revered places in many ways. To be able to be in the center of everything in New York.
Well, the question was actually addressed by a recently former student of mine who was accepted at multiple places, including Juilliard and Rice, which came down to, her final two choices. Um, and I said, the professor at Rice is a magnificent professor, and established track record and so on. And the professor at Juilliard, I know less about, but I'm sure they're wonderful too. Uh, but I said the same thing that you said. Remember, you're going to be going to study with a teacher, not with the institution. And the student said, "That's true, but to whom am I going to be listening at Rice, and to whom am I going to be listening at Juilliard?"
Well, speaking of Rice, that has a fantastic orchestral program, fantastic orchestra, probably one of the best in the country, if not the best. So it varies so much. Some people would thrive in an atmosphere, and maybe perhaps the atmosphere of whatever it is could be even more inspiring to them than the actual teacher. I mean, there are so many, we're so different. All of us are so different. And I've had students who um, thrived at various places where others didn't.
Yeah, it has to be the mesh of the personality, right?
Yes, and there I've had a student who for did not go to Juilliard when accepted and came to Peabody, and 4 years later went to Juilliard. And thanked me later saying that it's it would not have been the right time 4 years prior to
Hmm.
Juilliard.
They had to first gain the footing that they got at Peabody.
Confidence, whatnot.
Yeah.
I've had students who were not accepted to Juilliard the first time around and then were accepted later. And again, thrived there because it was the right time. I've had students who went to Juilliard and were never the same afterwards. So it's really, and Juilliard, there are many other places.
And each one has its own personality, yes?
Absolutely, absolutely. And to each his own, because some people, I've had students who hated Peabody and couldn't wait for to have a chance to go someplace else. So it's really it's there are as many opinions as there are souls.
There is no sort of checklist or algorithm that parents can go through to say, if my child is an introverted, egocentric, impatient person, then the right school is. There is no such formula.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, there are neon lights at Juilliard saying New York, Juilliard. It's famous. It's great. And people do get a lot out of being in that environment, in that situation. Whether it works as well as it would have worked someplace else, who knows? No one would know that. I think
But
it. I
but you
think
would
still,
you would definitely advise the search to begin with the teacher.
absolutely,
And
absolutely,
for that, do you hold with summer festivals being a good chance for prospective students to meet prospective teachers?
yes, yes. That gives in a more or less relaxed atmosphere. That gives a student a chance to seek out different styles, different advice that they get, and to see other lessons perhaps taught by the teacher.
Yeah, this is something that I don't know if it's your policy as a professor, but something that I've always sort of grown up with in Europe, the open door policy in lessons that everyone can walk in and sit in on other people's lessons, and I've noticed it less here. Maybe because as people are growing up, their lesson experiences one on one, usually once a week with their private teacher.
I think again it depends. There are so many variables. If I'm working on something very specific, something technical that is very specific to that one student. The others who would be watching this may find it completely
boring or useless.
or even harmful to their own way of playing because they may not need it. Um, but if you're working with a student, let's say, who's getting ready to go to a competition, and perhaps you're paying attention more to the overall presentation and talking about more general things, music, rather than specific technical things, then I welcome people to come and observe those lessons because it gives, first of all, it gives a student more of a concert level situation where there's someone else in the room, not necessarily just a teacher to whom the student may already be accustomed.
Well, the player, the student receiving the lesson, gets that, but
Right,
the observers also get something of a reality check, I think.
right. Well, some who are smart enough get a reality check. Others watch. I mean, I always find it very useful for myself personally to observe master classes.
Oh yeah,
Oh, absolutely. I always find
as
something.
much for the for the other students as for the way that that teacher giving the master class presents information. Um, uh, I'm recalling instances of people showing up at, let's say, the Paganini competition or others that I did, who would try to play Paganini Cantabile as their Paganini showpiece, and you think somebody somewhere should have given this particular player a wake up call. The 13th Caprice is not something that you play when you want to show yourself off.
That's very personal. That's very personal. But just in terms of summer festivals and master classes and all kinds of things that are so readily available throughout the world these days, and especially with now it's all online, unfortunately, which is better than nothing. Not quite the same, but certainly better than nothing.
But it also gives students access. Uh,
Yes,
how many students are you teaching now from abroad?
quite a few. Many students were not able to come back to this country to continue their studies, so we're continuing in a remote fashion.
Hmm.
There are some festivals that I did over the summer and even just very recently where I taught many students who were abroad. So I'm as I said, it's better than I thought it would be. It's better than nothing, but it's not even close to
No, of course.
being able to do it one on one in person.
Well, that's a nice sort of segue into the whole limitations of the virtual world and how it is that we listen as the adjudicators or teachers and so forth. So we talked before this podcast over the phone. We talked about the different technical setups, Zoom, FaceTime, etc. I don't want to get too deep into that. I want to talk more about where the computer world presents a limitation in how you would listen in person. Like what it is that as a pianist, what it is that you are hearing in person that doesn't come across necessarily over the internet.
So I have to qualify this a little bit. With the students who I have known for quite a long time, or even for some time, and the students who have known me for quite some time, I found that it was much easier because they know my language, they know what I'm uh, trying
There's a
to.
common point of reference.
Yes, yes. And I also can sort of guess, even if I'm not able to hear it 100%, I can guess pretty much what it is that they are producing. With the newer students, it's much more difficult, obviously, to start in a virtual world without having a reference point one-on-one in person. Um, of course, so much of what we do has to do with physically being able to touch a shoulder, to touch the elbow, to to demonstrate something of what it should feel like on your hand, which you cannot do, of course, in a virtual world. and that just makes it so much easier. And so it, just the time that it takes for things to click is
How many words it takes to explain the
right.
thing that you could just do.
Right. So that's I find that is one of the biggest challenges. The other one, of course, is the sound itself, because what we do is we produce sounds, and I think that's the first thing that the audience hears. They before they know how wonderful a musician
For
you are.
for me, this has always been the magic of pianists because you take 10 pianists on the same piano. I mean, yes, to some degree it's the same on the violin, but what is it that two different pianists do on the same instrument in the same piece to produce a different sound? I've always thought it was just a matter of voicing. You would bring out something that another pianist would not. um, how do you how do you explain a sound difference between pianists?
Well, no one can explain that, and no law of physics would be able to completely explain that. There is a sort of a notion believed by many that if you strike the key harder, you'll get a more powerful sound. If you strike the key softer, you'll get a more tender, more quiet sound. But that's basically just scratching the surface. There are uh, so many little things that affect. And you're right, you can hear the same piano played by two different people, and they would sound like completely different instruments. How do you explain that? You can have a really large person playing the piano and wouldn't be able to make as much sound as a 12-year-old. Again, what it doesn't have to do with how big you are. Um, One of my colleagues said something interesting. She said that, which I think you would relate to. She said that it's some people can play in tune on the piano, and it's true. When we have auditions, very often by the end of the day, the piano is completely out of tune, and yet someone would come up to the stage, and all of a sudden, you think that it's much more.
It's fine, yeah.
So it has to do with voicing. It has to do with how you hear things. It has to do with, or sometimes you when you go to a concert, you almost are able to hear the sound before the sound is produced. It's 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 inexplicable. That's one. I think it's one of the wonderful things about what we do is the mystery of things like that and how it happens. And
I think there is a physics element that I can explain to a non-musician about the violin, though, because the actual mechanics of producing the sound, where the bow rubs the string, um, can be observed and can be varied. But the
well,
moment
there's physics that can explain some on the piano, except that with other instruments like violin, you have direct contact with the string with one finger and direct contact with the bow. In piano, you play on the keys, but there's this very long
there's
mechanism
a long chain of Rube Goldberg kind of.
resulting in the hammer that actually strikes the string. So yes, there are laws of physics that have to do with force, with the distance, with the speed, and with the weight. And
And all of that will be reflected in the speed with
absolutely,
which the hammer strikes the string.
absolutely, it varies from touching the key a certain way. If you add more weight, less speed and more distance, or less distance, more weight and more speed. It's like chess players. Each level opens an infinite possibility, a universe of possibilities of sound. And
There was even a master class that I observed your colleague from Peabody, Marian Hahn, was giving in Italy, where she was talking to the pianists about mimicking violinists' up and down bows.
absolutely.
That
The laws of motion are the same. The laws of motion are the same. If you move a certain way in the piano, the same laws that govern that would govern the violin playing, except that you hold it differently, but the fingers would.
but it does feel like I know that I can attack the string differently either with my left or my right hand. But on the piano, I've always thought, whether you do this or whether you do this, the hammer still does that. Not
No,
true.
not true. Not true. Um, you can make the sound go up, you can make it go sideways, you can make it explode or get withdrawn. Perhaps some of it is imaginary, but I think we always talk about pianists always talk. I talk a lot about imitating different sounds because the piano as an instrument can imitate any instrument or even voice. And I think that's probably the most difficult thing to achieve and the most important thing to aspire to be able to make the instrument speak the way.
I've said so many times to if coaching chamber music to pianists that if I tell you to make the instrument sing or to play legato, and you're finding it difficult, take comfort in the thought that you're playing a percussion instrument.
Exactly.
And I'm asking you to go counter to the very nature of the instrument.
True, it's true.
There,
But at the same time, I mean, if you listen to old pianists, you don't understand how it's possible to produce sounds that they produced, even though it's recordings and whatnot. But it's also incredible that you could tell a performer from about two notes. It's very different these days because the level of playing has risen so high, the physical playing the instrument. Uh,
we talked about this with Professor Lasser from Juilliard, that if you stop to think about the kind of orchestras for which Brahms or Beethoven would have written, they would have killed to write for the Baltimore Symphony, to write for the New York Philharmonic, to write for and one of the reasons is, of course, the technical level. I would argue the technical level of all instruments has risen steadily for 200 years.
I would agree with that. It's just like anything, take gymnastics. It's unthinkable what these young people are doing these days. You can't imagine that a human body is capable of doing that. And maybe 20 years ago,
Well, I think someone has to be first, right?
right.
And when Paganini wrote,
Makes this different is after all the wonders of technical ability, what else is left? I mean, what is music? I mean, that's sort of a question, a much larger question. What is it that we do? How come people who may not even be musicians, who may not even know anything about music, how come certain music makes them cry? How come certain music makes them elated? Uh, I I don't know. It's
and the language that music uses is so intuitive. You don't go to school learning that a minor chord sounds sad, but you ask any random 5-year-old, I'll guarantee that 95 out of 100, if not all 100 out of 100, will tell you a major chord is happy and a minor chord is sad. Why do we think that?
yeah. These are all questions that define, I think.
But the technical side of playing an instrument, I again, here I thank the competition circuit for myself. I don't know if you feel the same way. The technical side I find to be essential if I am not to be just eternally frustrated by what I want to do musically. I have this concept, I just don't know how to get it. Having challenged myself for 10 years on the competition circuit, I find that was also a teacher. I had your father. I had my teacher at Juilliard Pre-College. I had my teacher at Manhattan School of Music. I had my teachers at Yale. But then I had the experience of competitions as another teacher that I feel raised my technical abilities. What is your stance on competitions as a pre-conservatory, post-conservatory path?
Well, these days, I think there's a competition. There are so many competitions. Um, there are students who enter competitions every other day, and I personally think of them as necessary evil, perhaps, because, as so many people say, this is not a horse race, and there's so much subjectivity. You know, you can't really please anyone or everyone. Um, and by trying to do so, which many students unfortunately are trying to do, they try to please everyone, so they end up playing very middle of the road uh, programs and interpretations, which leave really barely anything in your memory. Um, I think they're important for many reasons. First of all, exposure. Second, it gives you a goal, especially younger people. It gives one a goal to get something up and ready and to the level.
To a level that will withstand the stress, the
Right,
crucible.
right. So in you know that's a great thing about competitions. Uh, if one goes into a competition with all or nothing attitude, like if I don't win, I'll be crushed, that's very detrimental. Again, especially for young kids. Um, it should be considered, in my opinion, as a lottery. If something great happens, fantastic. If not, it is just,
But you would say, based on what you just said, you're arguing that the preparation for the competition has already accomplished a great deal for the student.
yes. Again, there are some caveats to that. There's a great danger because you don't want to go into a competition with a new piece that has not been played under pressure, that has not been proven under pressure. Because what if it's a recital, okay. If it's a competition where you're judged against others, then it may not be such a great idea. On the other hand, if you keep playing the same pieces all over, over and over again, then it prevents your growth and cuts out the oxygen, because you can only grow by expanding. You cannot grow by contracting. So that's a very important thing that I always warn my students about, not to just use the same.
Do you advise students to practice repertoire beyond what they're preparing for the contest?
Always.
Yeah, yeah. I was
There's a great story about Vera Gornostayeva, who was one of the great
legends.
legends, great teachers of Moscow Conservatory, great professors. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a great story anyway. A student came to her and said, Professor, I'm preparing for this competition, and which concerto should I play? Should I play list number one, Tchaikovsky, or Rachmaninoff two? And she said, that's a good question. Why don't you bring me all three next week and we'll choose? So that's I mean, I think that there's some truth to that, because you can't really know what's going to happen to a piece before you play it, before you learn it. So when students ask me which should I do, well, learn both, and
Well,
then one's
there's
better.
the other thing that you are not practicing piece A when you're practicing piece B. There are elements, that are in common from piece to piece, even when it's totally different styles, totally different, concerto versus an etude or nocturne. But I'm sure that there are elements within a Chopin nocturne that you will use in a Rachmaninoff piano concerto.
Absolutely. All music is interrelated. I mean, forwards and backwards. You can find all kinds of commonalities and all kinds of threads that go back and forth.
And of course, when you're as a student, this I would say to the parents and the students, when you are able to address the abstract, when you can get a legato as a pianist, when you can get the legato that you want because you are playing, let's say, something uh, transparent, and then you have to get legato in a thickly textured piece. You're If you have done your work properly, you're still able to think of legato as a concept, not measure 55 in the Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto Number Two. You know,
Well, everything is a concept.
yeah.
That everything begins as a concept. Um, I remember from my own competitions. That's why I almost never asked for comments. under those circumstances, because I remember comments from jurors. You know, that A sharp didn't have quite enough bite. Oh, and by the way, that B in the left hand, you could have played it a little bit more. Those comments I thought were completely irrelevant because, you know, who knows what came out and what didn't, but, you know, it didn't have much to do with what I was trying to do musically. Also, I've had comments. One would write, fantastic phrasing, wonderful sound, beautiful legato, bravo, and same performance. Next comment, no legato, phrasing is very sketchy, and why are you doing this? So it is so subjective. Again,
I
my advice would be just not to take these things personally. If you know, if you have a person that you can trust, that's we're coming back to the guide, to the teacher now. I remember in my 8th grade exam, we came back to find out the results, and I asked my teacher, what did I get? What grade did I get? And she just completely flipped. And her explanation was, it doesn't matter what you got, it matters what I thought of your playing. It makes no difference what grade it was. I did get an A, but that she made sure that I understood that what was important is whether her opinion of what I did, since she was the one who guided me twice a week or more for all these years, that's what should have counted first. And as a teacher, I realized it so much that this is really true, because there are so many defeats, let's call
yeah.
them defeats in competitions, and yet many defeats can become a victory at some point.
And I think I do agree with you almost entirely about comments. With, for me, a caveat. I always did go to listen to comments, being prepared to disregard the this A sharp was too little or that B natural was too much, unless some comment was so absurd as to make a good war story that I would then have something to chuckle over with friends. But I was always going to see if there was a common thread in.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely true. That's
So, like, if 10 out of 10 jurors said something about my Mozart concerto, even if it were all conflicting things, I would just know that my Mozart had failed to convince. But I had the exact same experience where the same competition, the same performance of the Mozart 5, one judge told me that I needed to practice with a metronome because I was too free, and the other one said that I was too metronomic and needed to let myself be more free.
this is one other example of how subjective.
Did Were you surprised when you first began to be on juries, having been a contestant in many competitions? Were you surprised by anything that you experienced on the other side of the table?
Of course, of course.
Like what?
I thought that the job of a juror was very easy when I did competitions. Uh, but then when I started judging competitions, the responsibility to really value what a person is trying to achieve is so great that sometimes you try and stifle your personal taste, your personal preference, to open your mind and to be swept by the conviction of a performer. And it's not an easy job. And I have made mistakes. There were instances where I was so offended by someone's taste in something particular, in a particular piece, I that mattered to me more than the overall excitement of the performance altogether. So it's a constant for me personally. It's I don't take it lightly. It's a constant struggle to find the right equilibrium of choosing someone who's not just middle of the road and non-offensive, but someone who
Who
really
has a future?
has a message, musical message
Yeah.
that can touch.
I I just think that the people who listen to a concert and make a judgment for themselves, they may not appreciate fully how much of a relief it is to be there to just, experience the performance, have your opinion of the performance, and not have to necessarily attack or defend that opinion, that subjective opinion, in front of colleagues with whom you have to make decisions of, okay, this person goes to the next round, this person gets first prize. Uh, the part that surprised me most was not even my reaction to contestants, but the conversations with other jurors.
Oh, it happens all the time. You like something where the other people, person will say, "Oh, that was horrible." That happens all the time, and again, that just basically reinforces the subjectivity of this whole thing. However, um, I've had colleagues who listen to a piece of music and they would think, you know what, this is completely different. And I try to do this myself. This is completely different than how I would have played it. Um, I would have played it totally differently, but you play it with such conviction that I'm not going to say anything. That it really reached a level.
I find that to be the ultimate compliment to either give or receive.
Absolutely.
Your vision is utterly different. I'm not liking it because you are obediently doing the same thing that I'm trying to do. And you've convinced me without making me necessarily want to play it your way.
When I was little, I remember my teacher, and a cantor, she would ask me to, by the way, she never demonstrated. She had something against demonstration. She expressed very rarely would she touch. If she demonstrated, it would be one note. She never played through things for me or for other younger students. She would ask me to play it one way, and then she would ask me to play it another way, and then she would ask me to come up with my own way. So from young age, it was she was trying to sort of provoke me to be creative.
But not only that, to be in command. If you want to, play it staccatissimo, sure, you've got the technique. If you want to play it legatissimo, you've got the technique. And now, what do you want to do?
Right. There's always more than one way to express.
Yeah.
To express.
What I've often found myself telling students is that there are many wrong ways to do a certain thing, to play a certain piece, to do a certain technique. But it doesn't mean that there's only one right way. There are also many right ways. So don't think that everything is necessarily bad unless, and don't think that everything is necessarily good. That there are no such things as errors. There are.
Of course. I always give an example of spontaneity. When people say that, oh, this was so spontaneous, I think I have a firm belief that spontaneity comes from having tried a million different ways. And then having tried them all, under pressure, you may hear something new, and then you've already tried that way. It's like navigating in
A well-known city.
a well-known city in the map. You can go this way, you can go that way, you can take a shortcut here or a long scenic route and arrive at the place where you need to arrive. So that's what I'm trying to impart.
My mother told me about Nathan Milstein, that he made a habit of practicing multiple fingerings, and often would decide which one to use right there on stage.
And maybe it's doable on a violin and a piano. It's not. I don't think it would be such a good idea because fingering.
You,
There's something to do with muscle memory. If you practice something, the last thing you want to do is to think, oh, which finger comes next. In my humble opinion, I mean, I try to make sure that the finger is consistent because I've seen disasters by changing fingerings at the last minute. So
so you don't change fingerings, but you will change phrasing. Would you change pedaling?
absolutely. Pedaling, especially pedaling. Pedaling depends. We pedal with our ears. It depends on whether the room is too is dry or wet, or whether it's a large room,
Oh,
small
I,
room.
I have to tell you, from Peabody, a student now, she lives down in Georgia, that I asked to accompany my students for a studio recital. And she very kindly agreed. She came down, and the piano at the performance venue had no pedals. And not only did she accompany superbly, but she actually managed to get legato where legato was written. A Peabody graduate. I am still, as soon as I think back, this was only about 5, 6 years ago, as soon as I think back to that, I am impressed all over again, because you are handed a car with 3 flat tires and you still manage to win the race.
Yes, that happens.
Well, actually, I want to talk about that too. The different, realities of the industry for pianists and violinists. One of the things that blows, I think, everybody's mind is how do you manage to go from city to city? Now, presumably, when you're playing, a major concert tour that has been organized by a top-notch agent and so forth, you will not sit down at a piano to find that it's got sticking keys or it's grotesquely out of tune or something like that. But I'm sure that you've got war stories like that.
Of course, of course.
How do you handle that?
Well, I don't know if you know the famous story about Richter, who had his Carnegie Hall debut, and he went to the Steinway Hall, which was at that time across the street from Carnegie Hall. Not anymore, unfortunately. And
Neither is Columbia Artists.
and he said that there were 12 fantastic pianos to choose from, so he wasn't really sure which one to choose. And so he chose one, and then for the rest of the concert, he was thinking whether he made the right choice. And ever since then, he made it a point never to try the pianos on which he played. He would just start the concert and adjust instantly.
So you are adjusting all the time. It's
no,
one of the things you
course,
train.
Unlike violinists who know what their instruments can do, even though there are some variations with humidity changes and whatnot, we have to adjust very quickly to a new instrument. There was another great story when Michelangelo, great Arturo Michelangelo, came to Russia for the first time. He wanted to bring his own piano with him, and the authorities, of course, did not allow that to happen. So there was a phenomenal piano technician in Moscow who worked on this piano that he was about to play for about a week. And Michelangelo came, tried the piano, and said, "Well, I wanted a race car, and you've given me a truck." On the other hand, Rubinstein came to Moscow to play, and they asked him if he wanted to work with the technician on the piano, and he said, "Oh, I just want to see the piano." So he was led to the great hall of the conservatory, where there was an orchestral rehearsal. And of course, everyone got up and started clapping, and he was with a cigar, with his hat, greeted everyone, and the piano was somewhere in the corner. Without having it open, without sitting down, he opened the lid, played a few notes, said, "Fantastic, great, great." So it's a difference, You may not get everything out, and besides, there are so many variations in tone, and one has to be flexible. One has to be flexible in your goal, in your music. You still want to deliver the best musical message that you can, but you have to be flexible as to through what means in terms of the instrument. So my teachers have always told me it's not the instrument.
No, it's not the instrument, but I find that when I'm playing on a bad instrument and somebody says, "Oh, that still sounds great. You're still making the instrument sound great." Yeah, but I'm working really, really hard.
Yeah, but no one knows that. No one knows that. My friend and colleague and my duo partner for many years, Ilya Kaller, it feels like he can take a board and make it sound like good. So it's and same thing with pianos. Some pianos that really sound horrible, someone can play a beautiful, make a beautiful sound from them. So it's a skill. It's what you hear and what you are able to achieve.
I would advise parents who are not musicians themselves and want to understand what it's like to think about rental cars. Not every car handles the same way, and let's take it a step further. If you've ever driven your own U-Haul moving truck, Certainly, your car presumably doesn't handle the same way as a truck, and yet you've managed to get yourself from point A to point B, presumably without killing anybody on a regular basis. Um, there is a reaction to the stimuli that you're getting, how the vehicle handles, how the keys are handling, how the hall is bouncing back at you, how the exceptionally dry room is seemingly soaking up the sound. So there's going to be a lot of subconscious or subverbal modifications of what you're used to doing. And part of practicing for violinists, of course, is to be able to do what you're doing regardless of the room. For pianists, as you go from your house to your teacher's house to the hall of the conservatory where you're playing the audition, every time that you're playing on a new instrument, you're getting used to adapting yourself.
When I was taking lessons with Alexander Edelman, who I really admired, he in many ways saved my life as a musician. His piano, because it was played so much, often would have missing strings, or there would be no strings at all at any given key, and yet he still insisted on a certain touch, on a certain sound, on a certain color that, and it seemed like he was able to do that even without the strings. So that always inspired me.
I'm just looking to see right now if we have any questions. Um, we do have a few, so I definitely want to leave time for questions, um, without taking up too much of your time. But one final question from me, or one final sort of topic from me, and that is again the realities of the industry um, in what happens after you graduate. So for a string player, so many people will start doing the competition circuit, the orchestra audition circuit. What is it pianists do?
There's so much. I mean, right now with the pandemic, with no one knows what the landscape is going to be after that. Hopefully, it will all be over soon, and the concerts will resume. Uh, I, I think there's a bigger question for a musician. Is there life after school, whether it's a pianist or violinist? And the answer is yes. Uh, for a pianist, there's chamber music, there's accompanying, there's teaching, there's higher ed teaching, college teaching, there's private teaching. Uh, as you know, no singer, no instrumentalist can do without a pianist. So that's great. It may not be. I mean, if an orchestra has 30 violins or 20, remind me of how many. I don't remember. So of course it's easier to find a job if you are not a pianist. If you're a pianist, you basically, you can either teach at a school or at a college. You can perform, you can teach privately. But if you love it so much that you cannot imagine your life without it, there are probably ways that you could make a living and make yourself happy.
And what you just said, that no singer, no instrumentalist. Well, yes, I could put together a couple of concert programs of violin solo,
Right.
but it's exceptionally limited. There are a couple of programs. As a pianist, you have infinite programs for solo recitals, and then, yeah, there's collaboration. You mentioned Maestro Ilya Kahler, your chamber music partner, but at a cello, you've got an entirely new field of repertoire. Add another viola, and you've got the piano quartet repertoire. There's combinations available to student pianists to look forward to after graduation um, that involve broadening your horizons when you are studying, listening to more than just solo piano music, listening to how other instrumentalists handle their instrument.
I think it's important during the study. I make so many references to other instruments when I teach because all music is interrelated. I think it's important for students to do chamber music because you learn, you acquire skills in chamber music that you cannot acquire just playing solo all the time. And that will, those skills and everything you do. Hearing how a violinist can create a phrase using one bow or how the bows change, being able to hear that and react. It's all about reaction. I've been so fortunate playing with fantastic people, really fantastic people, cellists, violinists, violists. That's probably the greatest joy that I've experienced is playing chamber with people that you, whose playing you love and respect. And just the process itself is so gratifying. And
It's
as a
it's
student,
got the best of all possible worlds, really. The interaction with another human being at the musical level, the individualized lines. Yeah, I
it's a language that if all understand the same language, there's no better gratification than being able to create on the spot without having to discuss anything. It just happens. It's
it
fantastic.
was one of the best professional experiences so far for me to do the Newport Festival, where in my first time there, I got a stack of music this tall, none of it that I had ever heard or played before. 16 different pieces to be performed in something like 12 days. 5 concerts a day, but a mixed and match program. So you're always working with different people. You're loving it, loving and living this piece, and then you're leaving the piece, and on you go to something else. Uh, there's I can't explain it to a non-musician, but there's something fabulous about deep diving into a piece and living with it for months on end. There's something equally lovely about getting to know a piece well enough to perform it, but then to move on.
True.
Well, um, let's get to the questions from our audience. From Matthew Chang. Dear Dr. Slutsky, I have a quick question. What is the main thing you look for when you're judging a piano competition?
Well, in a competition, it's hard to say the main thing. You have to be technically prepared to be able to express what you're trying to express. If you have a lot to say musically but don't have the means to say, who who has the time to understand what you're trying to say? If you only have technical equipment but have no message, it's equally useless, I think. So we, as a member of the jury, I try to just figure out what it is that the performer is trying to say. I don't know if it's the main thing or not. The main thing it's many things combined. And again, as I said, it's very subjective. Sometimes one has to play one note and you immediately listen, and sometimes you hear half an hour and the performer never catches your attention. And that happens in auditions sometimes. At the end of the day, we're all tired. We hear music for 8 hours or 10 hours a day. And then there's a person that comes out and plays two notes, and everyone just perks up immediately. This is magic. We'll look for magic, I guess. That's the main thing.
I think for for young contestants, the
Can't
key
hear
thing.
correctly.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
I can't hear you. You're crackling.
Oh, I'm crackling. Any better now? Still crackling? Testing, testing. I don't know if this is because the question popped up on the screen. Um,
Technical issues. I can't hear.
Technical issues still. Okay, let's try this. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Clear?
That's magic. Yeah.
All you got to do is count to 10, as I tell my
Good.
children. Um, but for young contestants, what I was starting to say, the key thing to take from what you just said is that you're not sitting there with a scorecard counting wrong notes.
No, not at all.
And I've never heard any judge for any competition on any instrument say that they've got a scorecard and are counting wrong notes.
No, I don't know any such judge myself. I think it is whether you can, for young people, you can make music if you have the equipment, if you have the tools to say what you want to say, if you believe that what you have to share, it's like a language. It's important. It's like any other form of art, with the exception of if you're a painter, you can work on a painting for unlimited amount of time until you think it's good enough. Then you put a signature at the bottom, frame it, put it on the wall. What we performers have to do is recreate it every single time. So no one is counting wrong notes. We want to be. I think most judges want the performers to do well, and we listen to each performance, rooting for the performers. And I think that the most successful, those who are most successful are the ones that are able to communicate something very important and have the means to do it.
I think that was the only, yeah, I'm seeing that was the only question from the audience. The whole point of these podcasts, like I said at the beginning, is to give the non professional, young musicians a sneak peek, but also to give their parents a sneak peek into a world that is very difficult to encapsulate and to describe. I do hope that hearing the same sort of thing today from Professor Slutsky, as you may have heard in a different podcast, let's say from another piano professor, from Professor Perry, as you might have heard from a professor of violin, as you might hear from an artist manager. I hope that these common threads form an impression for the listeners, for the students and the parents. For the guests, I am constantly just beyond words thankful that you give your time to educate people that you do not see, that you do not meet, but who nonetheless are going to be changed by what they hear you say. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart, really, sincerely. I have learned things today that I didn't know before either. So hopefully we can have another conversation sometime in the future, pandemic permitting, and your schedule permitting.
Just one little note about college admissions and whatnot. It has become very popular to try to enter a double degree program. And I think in many ways it's a viable option, because I think the kids today are so much smarter than in my generation. Maybe not so much smarter, but so much more versatile in ways that they can do so many different things. Just like the level of playing has risen so much, the level of what kids are able to do simultaneously has risen as well.
Multitasking and multi-specialization.
Yes. So that's also something to consider. If someone loves a subject other than music, that's a very viable option, whether it's Yale or Peabody.
So you're not just talking about someone who is coming in as a pianist violinist. You're talking about also someone coming in as a pianist chemist.
True. Borodin was a composer and a chemist, so why not? Tchaikovsky was an insurance agent before he became a composer full time.
And Borodin was the chemist?
Yeah. Made some wonderful discoveries in chemistry.
And Rossini was a marvelous chef.
Exactly.
I'm sure he would have had a chain of restaurants.
Exactly. exactly. So there are those programs and those possibilities. That,
Would you suggest to parents, for example, who are to parents and kids who are thinking about dual majoring, to contact, let's say, in the case of Peabody, to contact Peabody or Johns Hopkins, which is their path?
there are various ways. I mean, I think in Peabody double degree program, one has to be accepted in both programs. Yale, I think, is the same thing, which Yale is much more difficult in a way because the piano program is so much smaller. There are only 21 pianists in the program. I'm not sure that takes into consideration the undergrads, but there is a BA MM program in Yale, which is very difficult to get into.
Well, the certificate program that I did.
Right, right. So you would have to be accepted by both the School of Music and the university, same as Peabody. But there are those options. For some people who really can't decide where their heart is, what they want to do, I think this is a very viable option to do both. Some people can do it easily, some people struggle and then choose one or the other during the course of their studies, but it's an option.
Very, very good for people to know. So, thank you, Professor Slutsky. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise.
Thank you. It was wonderful chatting with you.
And great to catch up with you.
Very nice. Yes.
I'll see everyone next time. Next Friday, we're back to Fridays at 3 p.m. Next Friday, I believe my guest is going to be Mr. Dalton Potter of Potter Violins, with a viewpoint from the instrument shop perspective. Hope to see you all then. Come one, come all, and bring your questions. Thank you.